According to the Centers for Disease Control, suicide rates are up 30% since 1999. I sat down with a suicide prevention specialist who recently held a workshop in Hamden focusing on prevention. Sarah Gaer works at the Riverside Trauma Center and is the co-chair of the Pioneer Valley Coalition for Suicide Prevention. She explained QPR Gatekeeper training: question, persuade, and refer.
So question, persuade, and refer, it's meant to be thought of kind of similar to CPR. It's very basic steps that anybody can learn to save a life in a moment of distress. And so, when we think about CPR, that's obviously if somebody's having difficulty breathing. But in a way, if somebody is, seriously contemplating ending their life, they're having a difficulty breathing too. And so we want to give people skills on how to talk to somebody that they love or know about suicide, how to persuade them to stay alive and to think about reaching out for the help they need, and then how to get them to that help.
How do you know that somebody is not just, having a bad day, where it crosses over into suicidal thoughts? How do you know that as a parent in particular? Because a parent is really going to be the first sort of line of defense in this.
Well, the only way to know is to talk about it. And if you look at any other public health issue, we know that we have to talk about it, whether it's, HIV or substance use, and yet people are still really afraid to say the word suicide.
It's a dark subject.
It is a dark
awkward
subject.
I mean, so you don't say, hey, are you having suicidal thoughts?
I do.
You do.
I
so
do.
that doesn't put that thought in their head, because that must be an old school way of thinking.
It is. I mean, it reminds me of, when I was a kid and people were afraid that if you talked about being gay, you were going to put that in someone's mind. And I think we've moved past that idea, and we realize that, if talking about suicide isn't going to plant the idea, and especially in this day and age when kids are exposed to the topic everywhere they go. So it's not like this is something they're not being exposed to. So our goal is to try to create an atmosphere and a culture that can talk about these things and make it safe for somebody to talk about it.
Are there certain things that you will notice them saying?
Well, there's some research being done right now, looking at specifically language on social media, those types of things, and certainly listening to people is really important. Sometimes people will make very direct statements. Oftentimes when they do make those statements, we don't pay attention because we just assume they didn't mean it.
A direct statement like what?
Somebody might say, if this doesn't happen, I'm going to kill myself. And people often think they're just being dramatic, or they don't really mean that, and if they really meant it, they wouldn't have said it, right? So sometimes that can happen, but sometimes people just say things like, I'm tired, I can't keep going, I just want to give up. And we don't necessarily hear that for what it is. So part of the purpose of the training is to help people know how to listen for potential statements. And to understand that suicide's a multifactorial event. So there's a lot of different pieces that come into play. So how do you look for the behavioral clues? How do you listen for the verbal clues that someone might give us? And how do you look for other environmental things that we know are likely to be happening or could be happening? And if you see all those things, or see enough of those things that you think suicide might be an option for this person, how do you talk to them?
Behavioral clues. So they're spending more time. I'm talking in particular about teens, but it could be an adult spending more time in their room, not socializing. Give me a few more examples.
Could be isolating. One of the words we use is the ustas. She used to love to play softball. She used to love to take dance class, or he used to love to go to the football games. So, we watch for people not seeming to enjoy the things they used to enjoy, isolating more, being more irritable, sometimes not being able or willing to talk to people about things going on in their life. Sometimes it could be being secretive, increases in substance use. So there's a lot of things. And so the idea is that we want to teach people to think about it like a puzzle. And if you see enough puzzle pieces, then you know that you need to talk to that person.
So suicide rates, according to the CDC, are up 30% since 1999. What's going on?
I mean, that's the question. And in the idea of suicide as a multifactorial event, I think there's a lot of things going on. For the first time in American history, my generation, early 40s, I don't like admitting to it, but early 40s, our life expectancy is shorter than our parents. And that's the first time that's ever happened.
Because of suicide?
Well, because of three things is what they're saying. So this may change, but they're saying that if you were to take out the opioid-related deaths, the suicide-related deaths, and the alcohol-related deaths, we would live as long as our parents' generation. Some economists are calling that actually death by despair. So there's a lot of pieces, and I think as a culture, I hope we can start to really look at what is causing this despair. Of course, some people feel that the economy is a strong indicator. We see that globally, that the economy can have a really strong impact on suicide rates. But there's a lot of pieces happening.
But the economy is better now, so are just people more stressed? Are you taking on more? Are there too many factors with work and with families and with expectations of where you're supposed to be?
You know, I think for some people the economy's better, but when we look at the people who are most likely to be dying from suicide, and there's a very strong correlation between people dying by suicide and people dying by alcohol and opioids, for them it's not. You know, we see farmers, fishermen, forestry, you know, all have elevated rates, actually our first responders as well. You know, for a lot of families, they're working as hard as ever, as hard as their parents did, and yet being able to send their kids to college is becoming a bigger obstacle and challenge, or being able to save for retirement is becoming more and more difficult. So there's a lot of ways to look at the economy of it, and that's just one thing. I think, you know, a lot of people feel that social media is a factor.
Right, I was going to ask about that.
And I think social media, we see both pros and cons of it. We see people who are feeling more isolated. You go on Facebook and you always see how great everybody else's life is. I mean, we all know everybody puts their best life forward on Facebook, right? But
I think it does affect your psyche. I mean, I think you're looking at everybody else's perfect life, and you know, you start to think, I'm not that good.
Right, I'm not doing that well, right? And of course, because people aren't boasting about all the terrible things they're facing. So I mean, there's some question about that, you know. But on the flip side of it, we hear from people all of the time, you know, that they didn't feel connected until social media happened, because it was a way for, let's say, people who are struggling with suicidal thoughts and feelings to find other people struggling with suicidal thoughts and feelings.
So I know you had mentioned first responders, and I know that that is a training that is your specialty. Tell us a little bit about the stats around first responders.
Yeah, so we're actually losing more firefighters and police officers to suicide than we are line of duty deaths. So there's a couple of great organizations out there working really, really hard for law enforcement. I'm a huge supporter of the Code 9 project, which is really trying to draw attention to the trauma that our law enforcement is facing in the job, what their needs are, where they're not being met, you know, what departments could do to try to help them. And then for firefighters, there's an organization called the Firefighter Behavioral Health Alliance that's doing similar work for them. We also know corrections officers actually have an even higher rate, unfortunately, than both firefighters and police officers do.
It's because of what they see, correct? I mean, the trauma and the environment that they're in, sort of like a pressure cooker. So I could only imagine the pressures that they deal with every day.
Well, I certainly think that, you know, the trauma is a factor, but like I said, suicide's a multifactorial event, and oftentimes, you know, we see the same underlying things happening for them, substance abuse issues happening for them, you know, marital difficulties or divorce happening for them, you know, family history of suicide is not uncommon. Also the exposure to suicide in their work. So,
especially in a prison.
Yeah, so, you know, we try really hard not to minimize it to any one thing, but sort of realizing all of the pieces. But the other reality is, if you're a police officer and you're struggling with the trauma from your work, you might be afraid to seek help.
Right.
You know, you might be afraid of losing your job, or that people feel that you're not stable enough to be a police officer, and so it becomes a big barrier.
Tell us a little bit about the teen rate. I know that suicide is the second leading cause of death for 15 to 19-year-olds. So as a mother, that's horrifying.
It is. It's really scary. You know, there's a bunch of ways to look at all of these rates. In one sense, when we hear the second leading cause of death, it can give the impression that they're the most vulnerable, which is not true. The bulk of suicides in the United States are happening for the middle-aged bracket. So I think 35 to 54, that's actually one of the things that's new since 1999. Historically, it was actually our elderly population that had the highest risk. But when we think about youth, you know, there's not a lot of other things that take young people's lives, so that puts suicide high up. But the other reality is there's a real tragedy in the life loss. You know, that's somebody who's had their entire life ahead of them. And you know, our research is indicating that impulsivity is a bigger factor for young people than it is for older people. And so that really drives home for us the belief that if we had been able to get that young person the support they needed,
They wouldn't have made that choice.
there's a really good chance they would not have made that choice.
So really, the bottom line is you just really have to be on the lookout and listening?
You have to be listening. You have to be listening, you know, and we talk about, I think people have moved away from the terms of universal precautions, right? But the idea that just assuming that everybody has every bloodborne pathogen, right? First responders are especially aware of that idea. You know, and my rule is just assume that everyone you interact with is struggling on some level. And if we do that, if we treat everyone we come across with the assumption that on some level there's something that's difficult in their life, I think we could create a much safer community in general.